Mathews on fighting for economic and social justice, Thursday nights from 8 to 8:30. I'm going to speak a few minutes on the current topic of the day, of the week actually, with the tragic events in Charlottesville, Virginia, and the aftermath and the implications for our country and for our society. And then we're going to welcome calls from the audience to take part and give us your thoughts at 8:15, and maybe we'll go 8:45 today. So from 8:15 to 8:45, the lines will be open. Please call on the number, which is 562-234-3319. 562-234-3319. Be glad to have you give us thoughts about what happened this week and where we're going with our society, our country, and our families and our friends. The events in which many people were horrified at the responses that were coming out of the White House to the white supremacist, white nationalist against the taking down of the Robert E. Lee statue in Charlottesville, Virginia. And there were counter-protesters there to point out that we need to move beyond these divisions and to actually stop any kind of sentiments of racism or anti-Semitism or xenophobia or any of these negative thoughts and white supremacy. All of this has to be completely eliminated eventually off of, and sooner the better, off of our national condition. And yet we saw a horrendous exhibition of these thoughts, and the president wasn't strong in condemning them. At the beginning, he said both sides were equally culpable. Eruptions that occurred in the park, and yet on Friday evening, you had 250 white supremacists and white nationalists coming together, including the Ku Klux Klan members, carrying torches throughout the park, demonstrating and chanting that some of the chants they said was Jews will not replace us, the other things that were racially oriented, and they were out of control in terms of their incitement of violence. They should have been condemned immediately by the president, and yet when he responded on both sides, when the people who were there to counter-protest were actually there to say this country should come together and we should heal and we should be not just tolerant but appreciative of each other's cultures, and that we're only one human race. There's only one race, the human race. The opposite message of what these supremacists were promulgating on that day on Friday. And then Saturday they came back. The supremacists came back, and some of them were armed. We saw the pistols on their side. We saw clubs. We saw shields that they were wearing. And that clash occurred with them when they clashed when the supremacists provoked it. It was tremendous. And of course, it erupted in the most tragic event of the day when in spirit. Her name was Heather Hires, who was a young 32-year-old young woman who was a paralegal, a fighter for social justice and fairness. Her grandfather and her mom said that she was always that way, from the youngest of age, wanting to have a society and relationships with people, among people that are fair, equitable, and socially just. This young woman was killed when one of the white supremacists and white nationalists drove his Dodge car a muscle car into the crowd and mowed people down and injured dozens of people, ended up killing her. In the process, two policemen who were in helicopters, their helicopter crashed also while they were observing all the events and trying to keep track of it. And yet, so you could say the tragedy of the day ended up with 3 deaths. It was a horrendous time. And when President Trump went on there on Saturday, and he said that, you know, both sides were equally culpable. He's also said there were good people on both sides. Well, I'm not sure how many good people there were who were chanting with torches that Jews will be replaced, and several other things and statements that they made that were not very conducive to ethnic and racial harmony. And they said, these are our streets. They made it clear what the ideology of supremacy, of white nationalism and supremacy espouses, that America, in their words, America is a country that was built by then they're what they call the white race, and they say this country belongs to them and not to any other people, and that it should be a right reactionary scenario of society, one in which there's a right reactionary condition of social Darwinism. That's what these folks are about, these people are about, and we should condemn their actions and even their speech. You know, they have a right to go to the park and speak, but they don't have a right to incite violence. The Supreme Court has decided that free speech is definitely guaranteed by our Constitution, and yet speech has to be modified or curtailed if it incites violence. It has to be prohibited. Incitement to violence in the free speech is not free speech. It is an danger to the whole community. And as the justices decided years ago in that case, that you cannot yell fire in a crowded theater, that the word fire, if you yell that out and people believe there's a fire going on, whether it is or not, especially if there's no fire, you falsely yell fire because you felt like speaking it, then some people start stampeding and crowding to get out the room and kill each other, run over each other and kill each other, that's an incitement to violence. So there has to be some modification of how the protests, you know, it should be completely peaceful, these protests. And one side is far more violent and promulgates violence for the sake of it, promulgates dominance over the rest of society, other groups in society. They were using words that were horrible, the F word to describe people, which it's a bad word that's used to derogatory term for gay men, was used by them, the F word. Right? I'm talking about the white supremacists who were marching on Friday night. On Saturday, they were out there in full force, even more of them. And this time they were armed, like I said, on Saturday. And then when President Trump made his statements, in the middle of those two statements, from the Saturday statement to the Monday statement, on Sunday he was saying that both sides are equally, he was saying that on Monday, I should say on the middle statement, on Sunday, the president said that he condemns any form of racism. He condemns any groups, including the Ku Klux Klan and white supremacists or white nationalists, for inciting violence, for becoming violent, for speaking out hateful terms. The president said he condemned them, but he was reading from a speech, a teleprompter that someone had written for him. The next day, on Monday, the president could not stand the fact that people in his staff, apparently, and advisors had told him to calm the rhetoric, to be fair and to be ethical about it, to call it the way it was, to show who were the haters, who were the ones who incited the violence. When his staff and advisors told him about that, he went there on Sunday and read off of a teleprompter, off of notes, saying that one side is more culpable and one side should be blamed. He's against the hatred and violence. He's against racism and white supremacy. And then on Monday he was steaming and he couldn't stomach the fact that he had changed his views on his formally speaking on his paper that he read. That on Monday he exploded. He decided to say that there were two sides there, and that both sides were equally culpable for the violence. And this was absolutely not true. If you look at it, the ideology of right reactionaries is that violence is a valuable instrument to separate the strong from the weak. And they espouse this. They go back to, many of them are using the ideology of the old Confederacy, that the South should rise again and that African Americans should be kept in their place. For example, the whole thing started when the city had voted to remove the statue of Robert E. Lee, the Southern general who had led the Confederate forces against the Union, to break away from the Union and to support slavery. He had done that. Robert E. Lee he was a Victoria general who led the Southern forces, who also surrendered in the end and decided not to go to a guerrilla war to save lives. He did surrender. So yet he was also a slave owner. And yet this statue was up there, put up years later after the Civil War, to intimidate African American people, to make it horrible and stressful for African Americans to walk by those statues and see the Confederacy glorified again in those forms, that statue of Robert E. Lee and others. And this was a democratic vote to eventually take the statue down. They actually had a decision to do that. And that's what these supremacists were protesting, that the removal of the Robert E. Lee statue, which they call the heritage. Well, what did Robert E. Lee stand for? Robert E. Lee, besides being a Southern general in the Confederacy, and the man who surrendered in the end to the Union, was someone who fought to break up the Union. And so for Donald Trump to say that George Washington will be next and Thomas Jefferson will be next, their statue will be taken down because they were slave owners, that's totally disingenuous, because Robert E. Lee was not just a slave owner. Robert E. Lee was the general of the South that seceded and that had wanted to break up the Union. And many would say that they acted in a manner that was completely illegal. And Robert E. Lee was fought for that. He was not just a slave owner, he was also the promulgator of, in addition to Jefferson Davis and other leaders, of breaking up the Union over the issue of slavery, and to therefore propagate the Southern way of life, which was slave ownership, one human being owning many others and treating them, enslaving them, and treating them in a horrible, dehumanized condition. Robert E. Lee and all the other Southern leaders supported that. So how would the president say that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson are next to be taken, their statue will be taken down, when these men, Washington and Jefferson, never advocated breaking up the Union? In fact, they advocated keeping the Union together, and they were the founders of the Union. Granted, they were slave owners, and certainly Jefferson had in his conscience agonized over his lifetime about the fact that he was a slave owner. He said, I shudder to think what God Almighty, the Creator would think about people like me when we meet him, to know that we've owned our fellow human beings and used them. And Jefferson, on his deathbed, freed some of his slaves. Jefferson also wrote the incredible words in the Declaration of Independence, the very powerful words that all men are created equal, endowed by the Creator with unalienable rights, those of which those are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And these rights have to be guaranteed, in other words, in the theory of Jefferson's of democracy, guaranteed by the state, by the government, to each individual human being in America. And if they're not guaranteed, or if they're in any way suppressed or threatened, then the state has to be replaced, according to Jefferson. That was the right of revolution that Jefferson advocated against the British government. Granted, Jefferson was a slave, most sacred document of our country, the Constitution and the Declaration. The Declaration of Independence came first. Thomas Jefferson was given credit for writing at least 75% of it. It was his idea that he adopted from John Locke, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Locke had called it the right to life, liberty, and property. Jefferson very wisely moved out of the pursuit of happiness, the pursuit of our own fulfillment as human beings, the right to make a living with our talents. So Jefferson's words were very uplifting, and we have to continue honoring people like Jefferson and Washington, and you cannot compare them to Robert E. Lee, as the president did. That President Trump needs to go back and look at the standing of these folks and what they did in the past in our history and who they were. And when countries and societies build monuments, they build monuments to their ideals, enshrining and espousing the ideals of the country. So the ideals of the United States were not to preserve slavery or to break away from the Union, as Robert E. Lee had actually fought for. The ideals were instead the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that every human being has those rights. Thomas Jefferson did not write, all white men are created equal. He wrote, all men are created equal, generic, so that all human beings would be considered to be equal. So you cannot equate Thomas Jefferson with Robert E. Lee. And I think that we should get this straight right now and work toward harmony. First of all, we have to name and call what it is when there's white supremacy and racism in the form of Ku Klux Klan and other groups of people that are coming together. In fact, the rally was called Unite the Right. Unite the Right. That was held in Charlottesville. And they were coming together, all these right-wing extremist groups, to promote their agenda and to actually praise Donald Trump. In fact, the next day you had David Duke, the former leader of the Ku Klux Klan, who ran for the state assembly in Louisiana and won office and served several terms. David Duke was out there praising President Trump and saying he's given them a boost, the right-wing fanatics a boost, the right-wing extremist fanatics, the neo-Nazis and Ku Klux Klan and fascists a boost. He was praising President Trump for doing that. So now we're back to square one, or where, I'm not sure what square we're at actually, because you're looking at a country that's so polarized now and so divided. And I think the vast majority of Americans condemn, I look at the polling, vast majority condemn what those white supremacists did in Charlottesville and what they provoked and what they're threatening to do once again across the country. So we need to make sure that each of us looks in our heart, looks in the mirror and asks ourselves, who are we as Americans? And what is America? What do we stand for as a nation? What is the vision of our country? And the Bible says, where there is no vision, the people perish. I think the American vision is the vision of people like Dr. Martin Luther King, John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, Franklin Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt, Harriet Tubman, so many fighters for freedom, anti-slavery fighters, abolitionists, women's equality, Susan B. Anthony, people like that who fought for recognition that every human being is equal in the sight of the Creator or in the sight of humanity. And if you're not a religious person, you don't believe in the Creator, that's fine. But you believe we all belong to the same human family. I'm sure you do, most of you. So most Americans are on the right side of history here and are condemning what happened on the part of the right-wing extremists, one of whom ended up ramming his car into a crowd of counter-protesters who were on the side of the right side of history, of righteousness. These crowds of protesters who were made up of all ethnicities coming together and saying, stop the hate, stop these right-wing extremists from turning America into a land of hate. These folks, of which one of the most incredibly beautiful examples was Heather Hyers, who was a 32-year-old young woman with such spirit for fairness and justice all her life. She was out there on the front lines fighting for this as she was mowed down brutally by this car driver of the Dodge car that he drove with hatred. And we have to look into this and see and make sure that he's fully prosecuted and these incidents don't happen again. And yet it's being threatened to happen. So I would like to maybe turn this over to the audience. If any of you want to call in, let's make sure my phone is on here at the right number. It's area code 562-234-3319. 562-234-3319. So please feel free to pick up the phone, give us a call. I'll answer it and you'll be online. You'll be actually, your voice will be carried on the broadcast and you'll be able to take part in the discussion and offer us and share with us your viewpoints of what's happening. I would like to actually talk a bit about economic justice, but also social justice, because it's not just about economics. Economics is the basis of almost everything in terms of our political structures, our power relationships, our inequality equations. Economics underlie almost all of that. And yet there's a social side to life as well that is not directly economic, but it has to do with how we look at each other, how we value each other. Do we believe in human dignity and that all human beings are equal in terms of social dignity and a spirit of human beings within us that's equal and part of the larger universe and larger family, that we are part of that family as human beings equal to each other? If you believe that and you believe the words of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, of course in the 21st century we would make that all men and women are created equal, endowed by the Creator with unalienable rights, rights that cannot be taken away from us. They are inherent natural rights, the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If you believe that, and that the government has to guarantee these rights, then you have to also believe in social equality, that each of us is equal as a human being. But these extremists on the right side of the spectrum, the far right, including the neo-Nazis, neo-fascists, Ku Klux Klan, white supremacists, these folks believe that we're not all equal, that some people are far more superior to others, meaning themselves and their own ethnic group is superior to everyone else, and that everyone else has to toe the line and fall in line, that this country doesn't belong to everyone equally. And that has to be completely fought with morality and moral courage. Dr. Martin Luther King did, as Eleanor Roosevelt did. She was a champion for civil rights, Eleanor Roosevelt. I remember one time when there was a segregated meeting she had to go to talk to a group of women, I believe, and half of the women, or part of the women who are African-American, the African-American women were put on one side of the room and the white women sat on the other side of the room. Eleanor Roosevelt stood in the middle of the room, 1 foot on each side, and spoke the powerful words that she put forward, the belief that we are all created equal and we should start living and walking our talk. It's those kinds of heroes and heroines that we should really be looking up to and going back to and looking at our hearts and seeing that our intuition and our spiritual principles tell us that this country can be, and has been in many ways, a wonderful and great country when it fought for in the Civil War against slavery, when the abolitionists began the movement even earlier, when the slaves themselves rose up and gave their lives many times for social justice and for freedom, and when other people of all ethnicities came together, including some of the former slave owners, and confessed their errant ways and actually joined the side of liberation, freedom and equality. When we do that, then we live up to Americans' greatest aspirations. Looks like we got a phone call coming in here. We're going to hear from the audience. Yes. Good evening, sir. Yes. Could you speak up a little bit? 1 second, please. I'll get you on the speaker. Go ahead. Tony Castro. Tony Castro calling from
the city of Orange.
City of Orange in Orange County. Tony, please let us know. You've been watching. Have you been watching the show a little bit and what we've said so far? And
yeah, I've been watching the show and been listening to everything you've been saying.
I'd love to hear from you. Yes.
Yeah, I was watching the news, and I was watching. It looked like maybe one of the alt-right guys, and he says we're not. This was on Fox 11 News or I think it was NBC actually, or one of those, but one of the mainstream media. And this guy says, looked like a neo-Nazi guy, like a bald-headed. And he says, we're not non-violent. I don't care if those other side is non-violent. I'm not, and we're not. And he says, well, on live TV, he's threatening lives, saying, I will, and he'll kill somebody. He's saying, and and that was one of the alt-right. One of the people on the alt-right side.
So you heard this tonight, Tony, on the news? Was that tonight on Fox or NBC? Or NBC?
That was last night.
Last night. And did he say what group he was with or what he was fighting for? Because you're talking about total advocacy, admitting of that, the use of violence, which, by the way, is totally unconstitutional. And you know that the courts have decided that it's against the law, against the rules of society to advocate the use of violence. To advocate the use of violence to in any way threaten or overthrow the government. That is totally unconstitutional. It's illegal. It is domestic terrorism. Tony, thank you for bringing those important terms in there. That's great. That term is so important. That wasn't even mentioned by the president. Did the president talk about terrorism? Did he condemn the terrorism that occurred in Charlottesville?
And the president, oh man, I can't believe that Trump's saying that there's both sides. He's saying both sides has bad people. And he says, but one side has very bad people, but he never pointed his finger at which side had the very bad people. And I think that he was indirectly choosing sides. I think we got to ask him, what side are you on? And directly, you can get a direct answer from him.
Right. And
but yeah, I'm non-violent. I believe in non-violent and peaceful movements.
yes.
And I believe in direct democracy and non-violent direct democracy and non-violent revolution.
You and I both believe in non-violent change. We believe in grassroots democracy, and we believe in making demands on the elites to change their ways and bring about social justice. But we believe in doing that non-violently. And you're telling me this man like Mahatma Gandhi, like Dr. Martin Luther King, like Cesar Chavez, many of the American advocates of nonviolence, and the Indian ones also in the case of Gandhi. We believe in that. Am I right, Tony? I know I do.
Yes. And,
so what was this man saying?
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Yes. The man on TV was just completely opposite, you're saying?
Yeah, he was, I'm not racist, but the man was a white male, and he had a bald head and blonde hair, a shaved head. He had, you could see that he had like blonde hair, blue eyes, but it was shaved with a shaved head. And
so let's see.
He had his shirt off. He was acting very irrational and unreasonable. He had his shirt off. He was pumped up. His blood was flowing real fast, and his heart was beating real hard, and he was pumped up, and he was on the news with his shirt off, jumping up and down, saying, I'm not nonviolent. And he was saying, I don't even want to repeat exactly what he said, but he was directly saying that he will kill somebody.
Okay,
he's not nonviolent.
Right. Let's talk about the word terrorism. The definition of it academically and professionally, those who study it professionally, say that terrorism is an act of terror, of violence against innocent civilians, innocent people, in order to make a political point. An act of violence against innocent people to make a political point. Now, do you think that those protesters on Saturday, because on Friday they were using the torches, they were walking around saying terrible things in their words. They said, Jews will not replace us. And they were talking like that, very anti-Semitic, very anti-Semitic. So they were saying things that could incite violence, but on Saturday they started the violence. They came armed, they had guns with them, they had clubs, they had shields like blocking their those guys were armed. So let me ask you this. Do you think that this could occur again? Could there be another Charlottesville?
Yeah, that's just, we haven't even seen the climax yet. This is alt-right and I'm left-wing, but I'm American. I'm a high-propensity voter. We all need the same thing. We all need education and table
right.
But I hate to divide and go with I'm on the left and then on the right and we're on different sides. I hate to even look at it like that. But
right. Let me do a little analysis of the election, because this thing began with the Trump election to some extent. I mean, there was hatred and there was even before Trump got here, right? But look at how emboldened. But look at how emboldened they've become. Look at how they didn't even put their robes on. They were out there in their own outfits and the armor and whatever else they wore. But they didn't even have this on Friday night. So let's talk a bit about that. I wanted to say that if you look at the numbers, there were millions of voters who had voted for Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012. For example, in swing states like Michigan, a lot of them were blue-collar voters who had lost jobs. Millions of them in those swing states voted for Trump this time. These were Barack Obama voters, Tony. I'm going to give you a specific county, Macomb County, Michigan. That county went by a few thousand votes for Trump, and it put the whole state of Michigan over on Trump's side, the electoral votes for Trump. Because those blue-collar voters who were not racist, they were people who voted for Barack Obama twice, had felt so disillusioned and defeated by not getting any jobs, by losing their jobs, first of all, to exported to low-wage countries like Mexico and China. They lost their manufacturing jobs, and they had no having a worse time than they were when they were young. And these folks voted, went across. So I would like to say that not all of Donald Trump's supporters are racist, but there's a certain significant number, maybe a few million, that are racist, and that include people. I don't think those people like for him again. Let me ask you this: do you think any Klan members voted for Trump in this election?
Yes.
Do you think any white supremacists voted for Trump in this election?
I'm definitely sure.
White nationalists?
I know it.
White nationalists? Of course they did. They were proud of it. David Duke came out there, the former Klan leader, on this weekend after the Charlottesville the speech that Trump made, saying that the one side is more to blame than the others, that there's two sides to blame equally. Then he said that, indicated that he thought one side was...
The interview I was watching on the news, the gentleman that was saying that he is violent and that he would kill somebody and he was acting really irrational and unreasonable, he also said that we need a president more racist than Trump.
And that man, there was also another person like him in Charlottesville who was taped by the Vice news reporters that were there. They got a tape, who was saying that they want a president that's more white nationalist than Trump. And they said they want a president who does not, listen to this, they want a president like Trump, but even more forcefully so, who does not give his daughter away to a Jewish person, meaning his son-in-law. They are against Trump for having a Jewish son-in-law. These are the white nationalists that were out there that Trump was defending later on and saying that they're that the other side is equally to blame as this side. The other side that was fighting against racism, equally to blame? Are you kidding?
On Facebook, and it says you can't be a Nazi and an American. There was literally a war that the whole world was involved in about that. And
the whole world is taking notice right now of this. The whole world. They're watching very carefully, and they're trying to make some sense, but they can't even make any sense out of it. They're just horrified that this can happen in the United States to this extent, that the U.S. president can seem to actually defend and somewhat protect the white nationalists and white supremacists point of view. He condemned it verbally. Let's work this through. On Friday night, this event happened. On Saturday, the president, he makes a statement saying that there were many sides to the issue, that they were all culpable, right? So, which is like condoning what the white nationalist side did, which was far worse than the other sides. And then on Saturday, he makes a statement which he was forced to read by on Sunday, he was forced to read a statement by his advisors that made him seem like a pretty reasonable guy. He said, I'm against racism, I'm against white nationalism, I'm against the Ku Klux Klan, any of the extremists over there on the right, which includes them. He said, I'm against them, I'm condemning it. And then, you know what? That wasn't his own beliefs necessarily, because he read it from a paper. And the next day, Tony, he couldn't contain himself, and he comes out and says the same thing he said the first day, that there was equal blame to go around both sides, and they were both culpable, and there are good and fine people on both sides, and there's some bad people on both sides. What the heck does that mean? You compare the two sides. It's unbelievable that he said that. That's what the world is horrified at. Go ahead, sir.
And he also says, Trump said in an interview on the news, he says, I'm looking at the same pictures and the same news you guys are looking at. And first of all, one side is getting hit by a car and is in the air and getting injured, and the other side is saying that they're going to kill us. And so, I mean, is he really looking at the same stuff I'm looking at, or the heck is he looking at? But what I believe, these right-wing reactionary ideologists, I guess I would call them, I think they are capable of being more violent.
Yes.
And they're going to do it again in a larger capacity. They're going to do something bigger this time. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. But I'm afraid we might see a climax but I definitely think they're capable of much more. The way they're acting is.
So we have all got to be extremely vigilant, including the law enforcement should take the right side. The law enforcement should be on the side of justice, of fairness, and of the right side of history, and not take the wrong side or condone or allow the one side to beat up the other side. To run, the police have a duty here. Nationalist extremism. Let me just say that, if we don't get this thing under control, it's going to go completely out of hand, and it could spiral up into a modern day chaotic situation in the country, which is on the brink right now. And you need to have a president who will calm things down, who will condemn the wrong side, the one that actually was hateful, the one of whose allies, one of them drove his car into the crowd and killed someone. The other side didn't do that. Am I right? Okay.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I'm going to ask you something else. Who else is on the line? Is someone else calling in yet? Anyone who wants to call in because we got call waiting here. I'll be able to pick you up and put you on with Tony. But Tony, I want to raise another issue with you, if you don't mind, and that is the issue of these Confederacy statutes that honor the Confederate leaders like Robert E. Lee. That was where this whole thing was. The specific incident began with the Robert E. Lee statue being voted upon by the city council to be removed, be taken down, because that statue was put in place far after the Civil War. It wasn't an original historical statue. It was put in far later on in order to intimidate African American people, to show them that the South is rising again, the good old boys are in charge, and every time an African American walks by Robert E. Lee, they could be so stressed because look at what they think of this guy. Robert E. Lee was a general who led the South in a rebellion against the Union. He was someone who went against the law and was basically, not only that, he was defending slavery. He was a slave owner himself and defending a way of life where people were put under, enslaved. They were enslaved in a terrible situation, dehumanized, inhuman condition. And you're saying all of that the South stood for should be honored? Let me say something. I'm not for taking all the statues of history down. I condemn the Taliban when they blew up the Buddhas, the ancient Buddhas, because that was a faith that didn't go along with their faith or their religion. It's the most ridiculous thing. You got to keep history alive with these statues. But let me say something. A statue of the Confederacy, any statue, should be put there in a context. There should be large writing there to explain who this man really was and what he stood for, if you're going to have it there.
That's a good idea.
You see what I'm saying?
That's a really good idea.
Any statue that's a tribute to history should be a tribute to the ideals of our country, the ideals of justice and freedom and equality for all in the Declaration of Independence. That's what you should enshrine. And when President Trump tried to equate George Washington and Thomas Jefferson with Robert E. Lee, he was absolutely wrong. He was way off, because those men didn't fight to break the Union up. They were not rebelling and treasonously going against the government to overthrow it for slavery. They were not seceding or secessionists. They were men who built the Union. Yes, they did own slaves. That was their time and age. I'll never defend that. But let's put it in a context. Jefferson himself agonized about the fact that he owned slaves and said he wonders what will happen when God Almighty sees him and meets him on his deathbed. He freed some of his slaves, and it was absolutely wrong. Jefferson wanted to abolish the slave trade. These men were not equal to Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was not equal to these two founders of the country. Robert E. Lee is completely different, and Donald Trump needs to go back and take a history lesson about this and learn the real context. If you want to have generals and others,
you and I know this, and we're here on your show right now, and we both know this. I can't believe do people actually believe what he says? Don't they know what we know? They don't. Who believes it? I can't believe that people actually still believe this guy and are following him. But I don't think that people are they're not following President Trump based on like rational reason and facts and documentation and evidence and proof. It's like more like emotion and sentiment.
Good point.
And he got this emotional grasp on this targeted. He's almost like target marketing. He's almost like just a businessman.
I can give you some numbers, Tony. I've got some scientific numbers based on the Gallup poll. President Trump is now at his lowest approval rating in the Gallup poll that was taken this last couple of days ago. He is down to 34% approval rating, Tony. That's his hardcore supporters. I would say some of those are going to fall off as well after what happened in Charlottesville and when Trump's response to it. They're just so disillusioned. So many Republican leaders, including Lindsey Graham, the senator from South Carolina, John McCain, the senator from Arizona, Jeff Flake from Arizona. Many senators have come out and condemned and said that Trump needs to condemn these white extremists and nationalists and racists, and that they're doing it. They're condemning them and saying it's wrong, and that the president should not soft soap it and try to give moral equivalency to the two sides. These men, his own party, conservative Republicans, have come out and said the president was wrong in his response and should change his response. So this country has actually had some very good people who are fighting for the right thing. Only 1/3 or less support Trump at this point, and even less will support him after Charlottesville, in my view. You'll see. You'll see his numbers drop again.
I don't think that Trump's gonna get reelected again. He reminds me of like a Millard Fillmore or a Zachary Taylor kind of guy, or he's gonna wig out.
wig out. I like the pun.
Those are the wig party.
Wig out. No pun intended.
Doesn't know. They were presidents in the United States that were from the Whig Party, I believe.
Are you suggesting that President Trump might only last for a couple of years in office, that he might not even last for the full term, the first term?
I think he's going to wig out. And, I definitely don't think he's going to get reelected. I don't think he's going to, it's not big enough. I don't think I think the whole wall thing got him elected. A lot of racist followers.
Yeah, followed
him because of that wall, but a lot of people, like you said, there was Obama voters that voted for Trump.
Some of them, not all of them, but enough of them did vote for Trump to put him over the top.
Some, but they're not going to vote for him again.
No.
They're not going to vote for Trump again. They're gonna go for it, and just like we've seen before, we get an unpopular Republican president in there, and then the next Bush was in there for 2 terms, but then we got a Democrat after that, and same thing with the first Bush. Then we got Bill Clinton, and it looks like they can't consistently. It's kind of flip flopping, Democrat Republican, but they've been, at least most of them, been going 2 terms. But I don't think Trump's gonna make it 2 terms. I think he's gonna wig out in the first term.
You mark my words. If his popularity falls, his approval rating goes below 30%, enough Republicans will join Democrats to impeach him in the House, and enough in the Senate will join each other to remove him of both parties. That's bound to happen because I'll tell you one reason. The first thing that politicians want, they want to get reelected, and including members of Congress. They don't want to have a burdensome stone around their neck, dragging them down with a low approval rating that Trump has. They want to get reelected in 2018. They don't want to have the same guy in there who's going to pull them down, especially in 2020. So you'll see what happens. You watch as his popularity goes down. And by the way, he has to deliver. What has he got passed through Congress that he promised?
Yeah, the wall hasn't gone up yet. So
what about a repeal? The wall is not even on its way. What about the repealing of Obamacare? Is that on its way?
Oh, yeah. There we go.
What about all those jobs he's going to create? The high-paying jobs.
Well, he said he created thousands of jobs. Which country was that?
Yeah, and also what kind of jobs? Low-paying jobs. Yeah. They're not high-paying professional jobs.
Yeah. People lost middle-class wage paying jobs. And we lost 10,000, but we gained 1,000. We lost 10,000 good jobs, but we gained 1,000 cheap jobs
what else?
Under the poverty line.
You got a good point. And then what else he's got a problem with? He says that the unemployment rate is lower Well, the official rate might be a little bit lower than when Obama left office, slightly lower. But here's the problem. A lot of it's because people have been dropping out of the workforce. The workforce participation rate is the key number to look at. It's gone from 67% just a few years ago. It's dropped down to 62%. It's up to a little bit more than that under Obama, and now back it's stabilized again at about 62.5%. That means only 62.5% of all the American people that could work and that want to work full time are working. That's not a hell of a, that's not a great record for building up a middle class.
That are working, we have uneducated workforce because we don't have accessibility to a good educational system.
Yes.
And that's why we get people that are voting for Trump, because they kind of, it's unaffordable, the college costs, so people aren't as intellectual. They're not reaching their full potential as if they could have if education was free, like it used to be. So now we got this uneducated workforce and uneducated voters, and that's how Trump got elected. I mean, education has been so unaffordable for so long that people are just becoming, I guess, naive about not just uneducated in the workforce, but when it comes to voting.
Trump and Betsy DeVos, his education secretary, are right now on the path to, they're on the warpath to dismantle public education. They're cutting back on the funding for after-school and preschool programs. They're cutting back on tuition subsidies. They're going to privatize and encourage all these private colleges to get started and move forward and suck us dry and bamboozle the students into paying and going to student debt and getting federal money to finance their debt. And 40 million American students with bachelor's degree have a total debt of almost $1.5 trillion now. That's $30,000 debt each of those 40 million students. And Trump is not making it any easier with Trump University as a glaring example of privatization of education. Tony, you're right. Where is the middle class? How are you going to grow a middle class without an educated workforce, even if it's a technical education? That's been taken away also.
The worst part about this is that this isn't breaking news. This has been going on. This is old news. This is breaking news, but it's not like it's not brand new. This has been going on, and now people are barely seeing what's going on. But yeah, and I agree everything you just said, and it's been going on for so long now. I can't even afford to go get my PhD because of the high cost. I want to go to medical school.
Right, you do. And then what are you doing instead?
I'm willing to, yeah. I'm willing to. Like, if education was free, I'd go right now. I'd go to medical school, and I believe I'm intellectual enough to probably come up with some kind of scientific estimate or something.
And what are you having to do instead right now, instead of going on to school beyond for your bachelor's degree? Even?
What are you having to do? I gotta work, start my own company and work, and save money so that when I retire, I can have enough money to go back and get my degrees that I wanted. I'd like to get 2 PhDs, but I gotta save up money and possibly maybe even jeopardize a home to pay the cost of education. It's like a home. Do I pay a home?
And let's remind everyone, Tony. Yeah, let's remind everyone that it's not just that California had tuition-free education back in the 60s and 70s. It's that today, in 2017, every single advanced industrial country has tuition-free education, all the way through medical school and technical and trade school. It's in Germany, for example. That's what we got to have over here. And this is not what Trump is. Where's Trump's plan on? Where is President Trump and the Republican plan on that? A universal tuition-free education. Where's their plan?
That's definitely taboo. They don't want you talking about
They're in the majority, my friend. They are in the majority. They're in Congress. They are in the majority in the presidency. They're in the majority in the Congress. They're in the majority in the Supreme Court. That Republican Party, where are they? Are they missing in action? Why haven't they passed the universal health care system bill? Why haven't they passed the tuition-free education bill like Tennessee did? Tennessee has 2 years of tuition-free education right now for the last few years in Tennessee, for the first 2 years of college, tuition-free in the southern state.
We're over here fighting with each other. I mean, well, we're not fighting, but like these alt-right, they're fighting with us, and there's all this. It's just a distraction. We really, the elite to the top are getting away with all the money. Like when I see see what I see on the news, the alt-right acting violently and the cars running over peaceful demonstrators, and when I see that kind of stuff, what comes to mind, I see a politician, a rich elite, super wealthy elite with a suitcase full of money getting away, like, haha, suckers, you guys are over there fighting, killing each other, but really, really what we're after is the GDP, the gross domestic productivity, all the trillions of dollars that the United States is worth, and we're over here just fighting about irrelevant stuff like, Jews won't replace us.
Well, I don't think it's irrelevant. Yeah, but I don't think that's irrelevant at all. I think it's very relevant. The economic side, economic justice is extremely important, but so is social justice. And this stuff has to stop immediately. You cannot encourage people to talk like that publicly and go out and spread hatred by saying those things about Jewish people, about African Americans, and about Latinos and all the other people who are not white necessarily. These people are out of control. These right-wing fanatics, and the United States people will have to bring everyone back, have to bring them under control, and take back our government. And you have to mention this, because if you don't have any justice, there won't be peace. It's not just economic justice, but it's not just economic justice, Tony. It's also social justice and moral justice.
I see a caveman, like a prehistoric caveman. When I see alt-right, I mean, they're Neanderthals. They're prehistoric. They're like uncivilized. Like, people, we don't do that. We don't take off our shirt and run around in public saying that we're gonna hurt people, and that's just that's not modern. That's prehistoric. Man has evolved much further than that, and we're much more intellectual. And I bet you anything that guy does not have his PhD for sure.
We don't have to have a PhD to be a good human being, or to be an educated human being. You know, you don't have to have a PhD. You can be an excellent cake decorator, an excellent mechanic, and be a fantastic citizen and human being who's well educated on their own. So we just have to provide opportunity, unlike we're doing anymore. But I understand what you're saying, though. Many times these elites who have let our jobs go overseas and actually taken them overseas and given corporations tax breaks, these elites have us fighting each other over other issues and distracting from the economic side as well, you know. And this whole thing about just making social issues a divisive, well, that brings me to Steve Bannon. Let's talk for a second about Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon, the president's chief strategist within the White House, he was with Breitbart News for years. He was the director of it. And that's a white supremacist. If you look at the articles coming out of it, it's been white supremacists, white nationalists. Steve Bannon came out and had a very strange interview with a man named Robert Kuttner on the progressive left. Robert Kuttner interviewed him. Bannon didn't know he was on the record, apparently, but Kuttner said, look, if you call on the reporter and you don't tell us to be off the record, we're going to be on the record. So Kuttner recorded it and he made it public. And Bannon said things like this a couple days ago. He said that as long as the Democrats keep talking about race and identity politics and ethnicity, we are going to win because we're going to push economic populism. Well, the right wing, especially the right wing fascists and right wing Nazis and neo-Nazis, they do push economic populism. They do go after the big government and the big business both and say, we need working people to have a right. Look at Hitler, after all. Hitler brought in social programs. He brought in full employment or high employment for working people, working class who had lost all their jobs, brought them back into the workforce, made the trains run on time like Mussolini. These guys did it economically, but only for their own segment, their own favorite segment of the population, the white Anglos, they were called white Aryans in Germany, and not of the other Germans. None of the other Germans, the Slavic Germans, the Jewish Germans, they were pushed by the wayside. The Jewish people, 6 million, were killed in the gas chamber, and that's what these right-wing fanatics want to do. They only want their particular ethnicity to do well economically, including workers. So we've got to make sure that economic populism is combined with social justice and social populism that brings everyone together of all ethnicities for social justice. People like Bernie Sanders, his message was the message that included economic populism, social justice, and human rights and human dignity, man. That's the kind of candidate that you want. Am I right? What do you think about that?
Everything you're saying is pretty much, we just got to be fair and logical and reasonable, and pretty much that's pretty much what you're saying. And any other option, I mean, that's pretty much what it comes down to. Yes. Everything you're saying right now is just we just got to be reasonable and fair and treat each other. Kind of comes down to to treat people.
Back to the old golden rule, the ethical rule of whether you're religious or not. If you're an atheist, you can still believe in the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Treat other people the way you have them to be treated, the way you'd like to be treated. That's a simple ethical rule. If we all live by that, and I'm not, and these supremacists and Ku Klux Klansmen, those kind of people, I'm not sure they believe in a golden rule. Do you think they do?
It doesn't appear that way. The action doesn't matter what they say. A lot of these, I don't know what they're claiming, but their actions are definitely proving otherwise.
Let me ask you this: if you believe in supremacy and social Darwinism, and that might makes right, and that only some ethnicity is superior to others, how can you practice or believe in the golden rule for humanity? Is it possible?
It does not sound possible to me.
What do you think about that? Let's expound on that a little bit.
Yeah, it's kind of it's like people. You got to ask these people. You don't. Are you Christian? Do you care about people? Are you evil? Are you selfish? What is it? Are you?
The Ku Klux Klan claims to be Christian. You know that?
I did not know that. No.
Yes. Claim to be Christian, and I don't know what kind of Christianity they're talking about, because Jesus Christ believed in compassion, inclusion, and love for everyone, no matter what ethnicity you are. He even said it in his own words, and the Beatitude, the Sermon on the Mount, espouses that. So I don't know what kind of Christianity they're talking about, these extreme right-wingers. What do you think?
I was just letting my neighbor know about your show right now.
Oh, okay. Bring your neighbor in.
On YouTube.
Yeah. Mathews 11. Peter Mathews 1:1.
He's gonna check it out.
Live streaming. Check it out and have him call in too if he wants to. You can talk to us as well if he wants to. The number, by the way, for everyone in the audience is area code 562-234-3319. 562-234-3319. So we have to kind of wrap it up here in a few minutes. So he's got a few minutes to call. It's almost 9 o'clock. But go right ahead, Tony. Say a few more things if you'd like to. But this whole tragic week is coming to, just as we had thought that the crisis in North Korea, the North Korean crisis, is slightly in tension when North Korea agreed not to. So they said they're not going to launch those 4 missiles that they promised to launch against Guam. You'd think that President Trump would take in reciprocal action and maybe say we're going to call off or postpone the military maneuvers, the war games in South Korea in response. Don't you think when one side that's hostile towards you makes a move in the right direction, that you should make the opposite move in the right direction also? On your side?
Well, Trump, the way Trump acts is preemptive striking. So this guy's, we have pretty much, we're going to lead ourselves into our own destruction with our own technology is what we're getting into here. And this technology we have, it's really scary. What's going on here? We got these people in the streets, these alt-right race neo-Nazi people in the streets saying that they're going to kill people, and then we got people like Trump in office, President Trump, saying that he'll take whatever action he needs to take, and this is a violent guy himself. He's irrational. He's just out of his mind, and it's like a nightmare having Trump in office. I mean, I'm scared. I don't know what's going to happen. My daily life is directly in jeopardy. The way I live every day. And I mean, when someone like Bill Clinton was in office, I didn't hear about problems like this kind of stuff. I mean, we were in a surplus. We had money. Things were a little more calm. And all of a sudden, we get people like Bush, Trump, second Bush. We get especially Trump now. I mean, what's?
I look at that. When President Obama was in office, President Obama, you know, look at that. Look at the difference. Look at how he negotiated with other countries, how he tried to soothe and calm and heal people. I'm not saying he was a perfect president. I think that he should have not taken corporate money from some of the Wall Street donors. He should have been harder on Wall Street and come down on them once they crashed the economy. I think he should have done a lot of things. He should have brought back Glass-Steagall, for example. But Obama, you wouldn't be losing sleep when you're trying to sleep at night. Am I right? When he was in office?
Oh, no, definitely. definitely not. No. Yeah, this is definitely a big difference. Yeah, this is like a nightmare. This is like a movie, like a horror movie. I feel like I'm a victim in some kind of horror movie, and it's just a nightmare. Like, you can't get out of it. Like, Trump's the president. If it's not bad enough that he's encouraging these alt-right neo-Nazi guys to be violent, if that's not bad enough, he wants to nuke people that can nuke us, and it's just what's going on here? I mean, it's just.
Well, I think the American people have to wake up and start getting organized. They got to call their members of Congress and say, you got to do something about this. By the way, the very discouraging statement by Mike Pence, the vice president, he came out yesterday. I stand by everything that he's done recently. I stand by all of his statements. Mike Pence, whom I thought was a bit more maybe reasonable, more rational, more understanding about what's going on in politics. For him to come out and make a statement like that, I suppose he felt like he had to, but I don't see why he had to. Everyone, all the other senators were criticizing Trump for not being forthright about who was really to blame here. And I think that all the Republican and Democratic senators, many of them, not all of them, but many of them were criticizing President Trump, saying, President Trump, you need to condemn white nationalism, white racism, or any racism. You need to condemn it. You got to call the people out by name. He should do that. That's what they were saying to him. And he was whining, saying what basically that both sides were equally culpable. So it's time to kind of wrap this up. Tony, you want any last words for us?
I think it's urgent that people know, everybody that's listening, do not vote for Trump. Very urgent. Very, very urgent. Do not, I would not encourage anybody to vote for Trump. We need to get this guy out of there. Things are this bad already, and he's not even finished with his first term. He hasn't even finished.
Wait a minute. Let's get this straight to everyone. He has not even finished half of his first term.
Wow, that's even worse than what I said.
6 months.
That's double worse.
He's been in office for half a year. His first term is 4 years. You figure that out. What is that, 1/8? He's finished 1/8 of his term?
It's only going to get worse. I mean, we definitely got to get this guy out.
My friend, what is
I'm not voting for Trump.
But Tony, what is Congress doing? Are they in dereliction of duty? Are they doing their duty?
Well, I think they're sitting back and sipping on a martini in their hammock or something.
Well, it's going to be very interesting because I hear some Democrats saying, it's not time for impeachment. It's not time to even talk about impeachment. Got to wait for the investigations to occur, to continue, and the investigations going on with, Robert Mueller, which is true. But I think you have to look at what the republic, the nation, what are our chances of surviving and continuing as a nation right now, and what can we do to ensure that will happen, as opposed to letting us completely spin apart. And this is getting
he said he was going to make America great again.
Yes, make America great again. That's right. That was the slogan. Correct.
Yeah, but it looks like he's making it worse than it ever has been. I mean, yeah, he's definitely not making it great again.
I would like to research polling agency, as well as Gallup polling, as well as the Quinnipiac University. These polls are all showing who in America supports Trump on these issues, who believes what should have been said to these supremacists in what way, and you'll find that the vast majority of American people are on the right side of these issues. They don't want, and they don't want someone who's causing this mess. Believe me, the American people are very level-headed, and they have a good heart, and when they get the facts, they make the right decision.
I think that the rest of the world is looking at us and they're telling themselves, looks like capitalism and looks like conservatism. Let's not do that.
Well, my friends, it's about time to wrap it up here. Let's say goodnight to everyone. And let's remind everyone that next week, next Thursday, our show is back on the road now. We're back in town. In the studio. We're going to be on every Thursday for half an hour from 8 to 8:30. Tonight was an extended show because we had a great caller and we had a very important subject to talk about. But next Thursday night, 8 to 8:30, I'll come on for the first 10 minutes or so. And the last 20 minutes will be open up to the public for calling in. So encourage all your friends to watch next Thursday. at 8 p.m. on YouTube, Peter Mathews 11 or Peter Mathews 11. And then you go to live streaming and click on that. Okay, my friends, let's say good night then. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
Until next time. Thank you, Tony.